我们继续跟前欧盟渔业跟乡村发展执委费雪勒先生来讨论全球暖化的相关的议题。In your talk on Sunday, you mentioned that top-down approach do not work, and there's a lot of question regarding individual responsibility and how should individual contribute to this global warming issue. Would you care to elaborate more on this? There's more calling in the world saying that we should fly less, we should eat meat less, those kind of issues. And that shows how individual can really make a difference. People are seeing there's a 16 years old Swedish girl,
Greta
Thunberg, right, had really achieved a lot by calling individual to do the work. Would you care to comment on those?
This is very interesting that a 16 years old girl is able to change things. She initiated the protests, and in the meantime these protests are going on every Friday in many countries in the world, not only in Europe anymore. And the young generation, they, I think, are right when they argue, well, what the present responsible people is doing limits our future. Mm-hmm. And therefore it is a protest for future. Mm-hmm. And in addition to that, it is very obvious that everyone can contribute to the climate situation positively and negatively. Mm-hmm. This is partly the food we eat and the way how this food is produced. Mm-hmm. So I think we must act here more responsible. We have a closer look what kind of food we buy, how far the food is traveling before it comes into the shelves of the supermarket. Also what production methods are used. For example, we in Europe, we have now a substantial increase in the consumption of organic food. Mm-hmm. And organic food means that no artificial fertilizers are used and no pesticides, chemical pesticides are used. And both these things are based on fossil fuels. So this makes things better. But it's not only about food. Let me mention also the issue of meat. Yeah. The biggest problem here is beef. Yeah, because the ruminants they produce a lot of methane. Yeah, with their digestion. And they produce also a lot of manure. And if the manure is not treated well, then in addition, it adds a lot of methane. And methane is a much more aggressive gas compared with CO2. So therefore, it is really important to limit this methane production. There are studies available saying that if the average human in the world has the same consumption eating behavior as the Europeans have at the moment, with a big share of beef and meat, this would mean only from that a global warming of 2 degrees. So there's then nothing else left for any other thing. So, but apart from food, it is also, for example, the question of mobility. Yeah. So the idea is not to say mobility is no longer possible. This would be nonsense. Yeah. But we must organize our mobility in a different way. We must have less private mobility, where one person is sitting in a car and driving. We need more public traffic. and clearly we need also a change in the engines of our cars. So this is still an open question whether it moves more in the direction of electric cars or whether it moves more in the direction of hydrogen use as a fuel. Mobility is important. Then the next thing is the housing, heating and cooling of our apartments and of our houses. This can be done in a very environmentally friendly way, or it can be done on the basis of traditional use of electricity. So you see almost in all our living conditions, changes are necessary, and I would say the simplest way to do it is that we think more before we act. This would be important. And in that way, everybody can contribute.
You just mentioned that this had a lot to do how the food we produce. You were in charge of agricultural policy. That led me to wondering. That led me to wondering what's the relation between agriculture, fishery, and the climate change.
Yeah.
Some people would even suggest that because agriculture and fishery is mainly for to increase the food safety, so that had something dilemma with the climate change. I mean, if the human being want to increase its food production, that inevitably would contradict with the climate change that we are having right now. Do you think there's a contradiction here, or it's not necessarily be so?
Well, let me clarify a little bit these things, because in English we differentiate between food safety and food security.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you are speaking about food security.
Security, yes.
Which means that everybody in the world has enough nourishable food available. There are, I wouldn't say contradictions, but there are problems, because unfortunately the number of hungry people is increasing again. Right. And why is this so? Because agriculture is the sector which is taking place outdoor, and therefore agriculture is the economic sector which is most affected by environmental influences. And we must be aware of the fact that when we speak about global warming, it is not that we in Europe start banana production, it is that the frequency and the intensity of weather disasters grow rapidly. And these weather disasters produce a lot of food insecurity. So if we would like to increase food security, we have to combat climate change.
Right.
If we don't do it, then we will face more and more such disasters and more severe disasters. Right. And the situation in the developing countries will getting worse and worse. This is the problem in the agriculture sector. On the other hand, we must also be clear about the fact that agriculture is on the one hand most affected, as I said, but on the other hand produces also a lot of emissions. So we have to deal with both. And the production, the emission production is more with the industrialized agriculture, with the well-advanced agriculture in the moderate climate areas, and not so much in the areas of the developing countries. So this is the reason why I said before that it would be really very, very important to help the developing countries that they can transform their agriculture sector to make it more resilient against climate disasters. The situation in the fishery sector is rather different. First of all, we have the problem that we don't know as much as we know about agriculture, about the fishery sector, because the marine systems are very complex and are not so much investigated than the land-based systems. And in addition, you cannot transform much. You have to live with the consequences of the changes in the marine system. And the main changes are the rise of the sea level, and then also the acidification of the oceans, and then also changes in the sea, the temperature changes, the surface temperature growing. These things lead to the result that the likelihood that you can catch in many areas less fish is growing, but on the other hand, also in the sea there are areas which gain from climate change. So it's not a one-sided game. And therefore it is so important that we manage our fish stock in a sustainable way, which means you need an ongoing monitoring of the fish stocks so that you know the status of the stocks, whether they are growing or whether they are diminishing. And in addition, following the situation of the stocks, you can then fix the possible catches. You can then allow a certain quantity for each of the targeted species which you can catch. This is the way forward. We in the European Union, we have already for quite some time such a system in place, but we produce also certain problems at the same time. For example, coming from the past, the number of vessels which were allowed fishing is with the modern methods of catching, which are much more intensive and which produce a lot more pressure on the stocks. So this means we have to reduce the number of vessels, and that reduction of vessel means also less fishermen.
That include the foreign vessels as well, like the fishing vessel from Taiwan, for instance.
No. We are only allowed to manage the European vessels.
Okay.
And but we can fix who is allowed to fish in community, in European community waters. So we can exclude, for example, Taiwan vessels. This is possible. No, but the point is, that you have then to think about alternatives for these fishermen or for these little fishing villages. What possible alternatives do they have? We use, for example, opportunities in the tourism industry. We use opportunities in fish farming. We use opportunities in other diversifications, for example, that they work as guides in natural parks, as people who protects national natural resources and so on. It is anyhow difficult. It is not without tensions between fishermen and the rest of the society, but unfortunately it is in the end without alternative.
Finally, I want to ask you about your view on Brexit. Now it's kind of mess these days, and there's really much a stalemate both between European Union and the British government, and also within the British government, there's opposition and ruling party. There are also difference. Even within the ruling party, there's a lot of difference. I want to ask you, how should the European Union deal with this Brexit issue? And is there a way out of this?
Okay. Well, you were very polite when you said it is a kind of mess. It is a real mess, unfortunately. And it is difficult because, as we all know, it needs two to tango. Right. Yeah? Whatever the European Union does, if the UK doesn't agree, right, nothing happens, and right, the other way around, even more so. So, for the time being, the fundamental problem is that within Britain and also within the British Parliament, there's no common position, and therefore, how do you negotiate with somebody who doesn't have a position? Yeah, so it's very difficult for the European Union. And in addition to that, there is an agreement on the table. Yeah, this was finalized by the former Prime Minister of the UK, Theresa May, and since this agreement was finalized, there was no clear suggestion coming from the UK, no clear request what concrete changes would be needed. So therefore, at this stage, the Union has no reason to change this agreement. And anyhow, also the present Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson, he has obviously not much problems if UK would end up with a hard Brexit. And a hard Brexit means that an unregulated outgo of Britain in the end of October. So there's not much time left. And the Union will not accept a further delay if or as long as Britain doesn't come forward with a clear suggestion what they would like to have changed in this agreement.
But if this hard Brexit is also damaging the interests of your European Union as well.
Well, unfortunately, one should not underestimate both an unregulated Brexit and also an agreed Brexit creates a lot of damage.
Right.
Yeah, but it is right to say that in an unregulated Brexit, the damage is much higher. And in addition, there's a relation that one can say about 2/3 of the damage affects the UK and 1/3 the other 27 countries. So this is really a kind of setback in the progress of European integration. And I regret this situation very much, but as I said, there's no alternative to the present situation.
There seemed to be a suggestion that that the European Union want to make the Brexit as difficult as possible to scare away any potential follower of the want to leave the European Union, and. Now, since it's going to be Britain is going to leave anyway, isn't it time for European Union to move on and then cut it loose and as soon as possible? Is that the way to go?
Well, let us be clear. Yeah, these are rumors coming mostly from the opponents against the European unification, against the European integration. And in reality, I mean, this would be self-damaging if this would be the case. And anyhow, the other member states, in the meantime, see very clearly the negative consequences if another country would come to the idea that this country would also like to leave the European Union. And this is in both cases, whether it's unregulated or regulated. The damage, as I said, is always there. Yeah? And therefore there can't be a reasonable reasoning why somebody would like to achieve such a damage. On the other hand, if the UK leaves the European Union, I would say that this undermines also a little bit the present construction of Europe as a whole. Because when it comes, for example, when you discuss what role should the state play in a certain country, and what role should the private sector play in a certain country. So it is a traditional position of the UK, of the Anglo-Saxonian world, as we call it, that they are more for strengthening the market, the markets, and less state dominance. This is different in the continental Europe, for example in France, where the state plays a much bigger role. And in the past, as long as the UK was part of the Union, it was necessary to accept a certain compromise between the two concepts. Yeah? And this compromise was most of the time to the advantage of the Union as a whole. And if this Anglo-Saxonian position leaves, then I would say, at least in the long run, it is not to the advantage of the rest of the European Union.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fischler, to accept our interview and take your time. Thank you very much.
I thank you too.
谢谢各位收看，我们下次见。